Can we buy that boy, Daddy? Her small hand tugged his fringed sleeve. Harlan kept his eyes on the trading post dirt. Then he looked up. Through the dust and horseflies, he saw the boy's fractured front tooth and pale gray eyes. His lungs simply stopped working. Harlan smelled the settlement before he saw it. It wasn't a town, not really. It was a scar on the prairie, a festering wound of canvas tents and rough-hewn pine boards, where men dug for silver and usually just found a cholera grave. The wind shifted, blowing up the canyon, carrying the stench of sulfur, unwashed bodies, and stale rot-gut whiskey. Harlan stopped the mule. He pulled the bandana up over his nose and sat in the saddle, staring down at the valley. He hated the lowlands. Up on the timberline, the air was thin enough to scrape your lungs clean. Up there, a man only had to worry about cougars, winter freezes, and his own echoing thoughts. Down here, you had to worry about men. "We almost there, Papa?" The voice came from the pack mule trailing behind him. Josie was 7 years old, perched atop a massive bundle of winter-trapped beaver pelts. She was missing a front tooth, her face smudged with bacon, grease, and wood smoke, wearing a wool coat 3 sizes too big. Harlan wasn't her father by blood. 3 winters ago, he'd found her shivering under the floorboards of a burned-out wagon, clutching a dead woman's hand. He hadn't known what to do with a little girl. He still didn't, but he kept her fed, taught her how to gut a trout, and shot anything that looked at her wrong. "Almost," Harlan grunted. His voice sounded like grinding stones. He hadn't spoken much in a week. "Keep your hat pulled low. Don't look nobody in the eye." Josie pulled her wide-brimmed felt hat down until it rested on her nose. "Yes, Papa." They rode into the settlement of Bitter Creek just as the noon sun turned the street into a blinding white oven. Alkali dust rose in thick clouds with every hoofbeat, coating Harlan's tongue with a chalky, bitter taste. The thoroughfare was a chaotic trench of mud and manure. A drunk slept face down outside a tent saloon, while stray dogs fought over a discarded butcher's bone. Harlan kept his hand resting lightly on the stock of the Sharps rifle slung across his saddle horn. His joints ached. He was 38 but felt 50. A bullet still lodged in his left thigh from a skirmish down in Sonora made his legs stiffen in the damp, and the grease in his heavy beard caught the valley dust like a net. He wanted to do this fast. Trade the pelts, buy flour, coffee, salt, and maybe a tin of peaches for Josie, then ride back up above the clouds where the world made sense. He tied the mules to the hitching post outside Caldwell's Mercantile. The inside of the store was dark, suffocatingly hot, and smelled heavily of oiled canvas, cinnamon, and chewing tobacco. Caldwell, a thin man with pomaded hair and a rat-like overbite, looked at the pile of thick, luxurious furs Harlan threw onto the counter. The merchant ran a pale finger over the deep brown pelt. "Summer's coming on," Caldwell said, his voice slick. "Market for fur ain't what it was in December, Harlan. Best I can do is $30 for the lot." Harlan didn't blink. He didn't yell. He just stared at Caldwell. It was a dead, hollow stare, the kind of look a man gets when he's watched a wolf tear apart a calf and felt nothing. He leaned his heavy forearms on the counter. The wood creaked. "Those are prime winter catches," Harlan said quietly. "Trapped 'em in January. Cured right. You'll sell them to a buyer from New York for $150. I want $60. Caldwell swallowed, looking at the massive, scarred hands resting inches from his ledger. 45. 60, Harlan repeated, his voice dropping an octave. And a tin of peaches, and a peppermint stick for the girl. Caldwell wiped sweat from his upper lip and opened his lockbox. 15 minutes later, they were back out in the blinding sun. Josie was sucking happily on the red and white peppermint stick, her small hand clutching Harlan's calloused one. The canvas sacks of flour and coffee were loaded onto the pack mule. Harlan felt the familiar itch to leave. The noise of the town, the clanging of the blacksmith's hammer, the shouting of drunken miners, the tinny, out-of-tune piano from the saloon was making his skin crawl. "All right, Joe," Harlan said, untying his horse. "Up you get. We're burning daylight." "Look, Papa," Josie said, pointing with her sticky candy. "A show." Harlan followed her finger. Down by the livery, a crowd of about 40 men had gathered in a tight semicircle. They were miners mostly, covered in rock dust, interspersed with a few townsfolk. In the center of the ring stood a large freight wagon. Harlan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew that shape. He knew that crowd. It wasn't a show. It was an auction. Sometimes it was horses. Sometimes it was tools from a dead man's claim. But occasionally, in these lawless dirt scrapes, it was people. Debtors selling off indentured labor, or guardians unloading orphans they'd brought west for a profit. It made Harlan sick. It made him want to burn the town to the bedrock. "Don't look, Joe," Harlan said, his tone sharper than intended. He grabbed her shoulder. "We're leaving." But the crowd shifted, parting just enough for Harlan to see the wagon bed. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man in a sweat-stained bowler hat, his face flushed purple from the heat and his own yelling. "Strong back on this one, boys," the auctioneer bellowed, slapping a coiled riding crop against his leg. "Bought his contract off a failed farmer down in Missouri. 7 years left on his papers. Eats barely nothing. Good for hauling rock. Good for tight shafts where a full-grown man can't fit." Tied by the wrist to the wagon's iron wheel rail was a boy. He looked to be about 9 years old. He wore a ripped, homespun cotton shirt that hung off his bony frame. His face was smeared with dirt and dried blood from a cut above his ear, and his bare feet shifted uncomfortably on the splintered wood of the wagon bed. He was shaking, though the temperature was easily 90 degrees. $10! A miner yelled, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "I got 10, looking for 12, the auctioneer chanted. Josie stopped walking. Her hand slipped out of Harlan's grip. She stared at the boy on the wagon, her peppermint stick lowering. She knew what it was to be small and terrified in a world of loud, violent men. "Can we buy that boy, Daddy?" she asked, her voice cutting through the dull roar of the crowd, clear and innocent. Harlan tightened his grip on the mule's reins. He kept his eyes on the dirt. "No, Joe, people ain't for buying. It ain't right." "But they're going to hurt him," she whispered. Harlan sighed, an angry, exhausted sound. He couldn't save the world. He had tried that once, a long time ago, and it had cost him everything. He looked up, intending to grab Josie by the collar and haul her out of town. His eyes locked onto the boy on the wagon. The boy stopped staring at his bare feet and looked out into the crowd. Through the haze of alkali dust and the shimmering heat waves, Harlan saw him clearly. The boy had a fractured front tooth. He had dark, unruly hair that cowlicked to the left, and he had eyes the color of a frozen winter sky, pale, piercing gray. Harlan's lungs stopped working. The noise of the auctioneer, the miners, the blacksmith's hammer, it all vanished, sucked into a vacuum. The blood drained from Harlan's head so fast he swayed on his feet, his heavy boots suddenly feeling like they were filled with river stones. Those eyes. He had kissed the eyelids that covered those eyes. He had dreamed of those eyes for 10 years, waking up in cold sweats on the mountain. Sarah's eyes. Sarah, the woman he had loved with a violent, all-consuming devotion down in Denver. The woman he had begged to wait for him while he scraped together enough gold to build her a house. The woman who had written him a single, devastating letter saying she couldn't live on promises anymore, that she had married a wealthy railroad surveyor instead. Harlan had destroyed a saloon, bought a horse, and ridden into the high country, swearing off the entire human race. But it wasn't just Sarah's eyes. Harlan stared at the boy's jawline, at the heavy, slightly crooked brow, at the way the boy's shoulders sat square and rigid despite his terror. It was like looking into a clouded, dirty mirror holding a photograph from 30 years ago. "My God," Harlan thought. The thought wasn't a word, it was a physical blow to his ribs. "He's mine. She was pregnant when she left. He's mine." $12, someone shouted. 14. Harlan didn't draw his gun. He didn't shout and break through the crowd like a hero in a dime novel. He panicked. A primal, suffocating terror seized him. His hands shook violently. He dropped the reins of the mule. The reality of it was too massive, too horrifying. His son. A son he didn't know existed, standing in rags, being sold to a silver miner to break rocks in the dark. The guilt and the shock hit him like a physical illness. "Papa?" Josie asked, looking up at him. Harlan couldn't breathe. He grabbed Josie's arm too hard, grabbing a handful of her coat and spun away. "Walk," he choked out. He pushed his way through the edge of the crowd, ignoring a man who cursed at him. He dragged Josie into the narrow, shadowed alleyway between the mercantile and the assayer's office. He leaned his back against the rough brick wall, sliding down until his knees hit the dirt. He ripped the bandana from his neck and gasped for air. He leaned over and dry-heaved into the dust, his massive frame trembling. It tasted like bile and alkali. "Papa, you're hurting my arm," Josie whimpered, tears pooling in her eyes. Harlan let go as if he'd been burned. He looked at his shaking hands. He was a coward. He had faced down a charging grizzly bear with nothing but a hunting knife and a prayer. But the sight of that boy, his blood, his failure, his past, had broken him in 3 seconds. He closed his eyes. "It's a mistake," his mind screamed. "It's just a boy who looks like her. It ain't yours. You can't take on another broken thing. Ride out. Ride up the mountain." But he remembered the letter. He remembered the exact shade of Sarah's eyes when she laughed. And he remembered the stark terror on the boy's face just now.
"Papa?"
Josie whispered, stepping closer, wiping her nose with her sleeve. She didn't understand his sickness, but she reached out and patted his greasy hair with her sticky, peppermint-coated hand. "It's okay. We don't have to buy him." Harlan opened his eyes. He looked at Josie. He looked at the dirt. Then he looked toward the end of the alley, where the sun glared off the street. He heard the auctioneer's muffled voice drifting over the rooftops. "I got $18. Going once for the boy." Harlan slowly stood up. His knees cracked. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, smearing dirt across his beard. The panic was still there, a cold, writhing snake in his gut. But the flight response was fading, replaced by something much older and much more dangerous. A quiet, terrifying rage. He reached over his shoulder and checked the action on his Sharps rifle. The metallic times, clack times, echoed loudly in the narrow alley. "Stay here, Joe," Harlan said, his voice flat, completely devoid of the tremor that had been there a moment ago. "Don't move from this wall." He didn't wait for her answer. He turned and walked back out into the sun. The heat radiating off the hard-packed street felt heavy, like a wet wool blanket. Harlan walked with a slow, deliberate gait. The panic had burned off, leaving behind a cold, hollow focus. He felt the familiar pull of the old scar tissue in his left thigh. He smelled the rancid grease of a nearby cook tent, the sharp tang of horse sweat, and the sour odor of unwashed men packed too closely together. "18 I got," the auctioneer shouted, wiping his purple neck with a dirty rag. "Do I hear 20 for the boy? Good teeth, strong back. You won't find cheaper labor this side of the Missouri." A thick-necked miner in canvas overalls raised a hand. His knuckles were permanently stained black with rock dust. "18's my limit, Cobb. Wrap him up. I got a slag heap that needs sorting by sundown." "Going once to Griggs?" the auctioneer called. "Going twice?" 60. The word didn't boom. It didn't echo. It was spoken at a normal conversational volume, but the deep, gravelly timbre of Harlan's voice cut through the ambient noise of the street like a dull knife through canvas. The crowd went silent. 40 heads turned. The miners parted instinctively as Harlan stepped into the circle. He didn't look at them. He kept his eyes fixed on the auctioneer. Griggs, the thick-necked miner, spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dirt. It landed an inch from Harlan's boot. "The bid was 18, Mountain Man. You don't jump from 18 to 60. That ain't how it works." $60, Harlan repeated, his face a mask of weathered leather and coarse hair. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the thick roll of greenbacks Caldwell had just handed him for a winter's worth of freezing, starving work. He tossed the roll onto the wagon bed. It hit the wooden planks with a soft thud. The boy flinched at the sound. He pressed his narrow shoulders back against the iron wheel, his pale gray eyes wide and darting, terrified of this massive, bearded stranger who had just bought his life. The auctioneer stared at the money. His Adam's apple bobbed. "Well, I reckon 60 is the winning bid. Sold to the—" "Now hold on a damn minute." Griggs stepped into Harlan's path. The miner smelled of sulfur and stale beer. He was shorter than Harlan, but built like a bull, his chest swelling with offended pride. "I need a sorter. You're a trapper. You got no use for a whelp like that up in the snow. You trying to make a fool out of me, old man?" Harlan finally looked at Griggs. He felt the adrenaline pumping into his forearms, making his fingers twitch. He didn't want to kill a man in front of the boy. He didn't want to kill a man at all. Not anymore. But the violent, ugly part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive in the Sonora desert, whispered that breaking Griggs's jaw would be the easiest way to end this. "Walk away," Harlan said softly. Griggs sneered, showing a mouth full of brown teeth. He dropped his hand toward the heavy iron wrench hanging from his tool belt. "You don't tell me to." Harlan moved. It wasn't a graceful, cinematic draw. It was the brutal, unhesitating reflex of a man who viewed violence as a chore. He didn't reach for his revolver. He simply shifted his weight, gripped the heavy octagonal barrel of his Sharps rifle with both hands, and drove the solid brass butt plate upward in a short, vicious arc. The brass cracked into the underside of Griggs's jaw. The sound was sickening, a wet, muffled pop, like stepping on a rotten branch. Griggs's eyes rolled back into his head. His knees unhinged, and he collapsed into the alkali dust without making a sound. The crowd collectively shuffled backward. A few men cursed, hands hovering near their belts, but nobody drew. They looked at the unconscious man bleeding onto the dirt, then up at the giant standing over him, his rifle already lowered, his breathing completely unchanged. The sheer mechanical indifference of the strike was more terrifying than if Harlan had started shouting threats. Harlan stepped over Griggs's legs. He walked up to the wagon. Up close, the boy smelled of fear, old sweat, and copper from the bleeding cut above his ear. He was trembling so violently that his ragged shirt fluttered. He looked at Harlan's bloody rifle butt, then squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head away, bracing for a blow. Harlan's chest seized. A phantom pain lanced through his ribs. He saw Sarah's face in the angle of the boy's cheekbone. He saw his own heavy brow in the boy's forehead. It was a cruel, impossible collision of his past and present. He didn't speak. He reached down and drew the hunting knife from his belt. The boy gasped and shrank back, hitting the wagon wheel. Harlan gently slipped the blade under the hemp rope binding the boy's wrists. He twisted his wrist, and the thick rope snapped. The boy rubbed his chafed, bloody wrists, staring at Harlan in absolute bewilderment. "Get down," Harlan grunted, his voice thick and unnatural. The boy scrambled off the wagon, his bare feet hitting the hot dirt. He stumbled, weak from the heat, and Harlan caught him by the shoulder. The boy's bones felt like bird bones beneath his hand. Fragile, breakable. Harlan pulled the bandana from his pocket and pressed it into the boy's hand. "Hold that on your ear." He turned and walked back toward the alley. He didn't look back to see if the boy was following. He just listened for the soft, rapid padding of bare feet in the dust behind him. They left Bitter Creek before the shadows grew long. Harlan led the pack mule, Josie rode the bay horse, and the boy walked beside her stirrup, wearing a pair of oversized leather boots Harlan had bought for $2 from the livery hostler. The incline was steep. Within an hour, the suffocating heat of the valley floor gave way to the crisp, thin air of the foothills. The alkali dust turned to red clay, then to a carpet of dry pine needles. The smell of sulfur faded, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of spruce resin and cooling stone. Nobody spoke. Harlan walked with his head down, watching his boots chew up the trail. His mind was a chaotic, grinding machine. He had $60 to his name an hour ago. Now he had nothing but flour, coffee, an orphan girl, and a ghost in an oversized shirt. He had no plan. He lived in a one-room cabin that leaked when the snow melted. He didn't know how to raise a son. He barely knew how to keep himself from plunging into black depressions that lasted for weeks. "What if he's not yours?" the cynical voice in his head whispered. "What if she just married a man who looked like you? You threw away your winter earnings for a stranger's bastard." He gritted his teeth, his jaw aching. It didn't matter. The kid had her eyes. That was enough. That was the curse of it. They made camp at dusk in a hollow surrounded by towering lodgepole pines. The wind whispered through the high branches, a lonely, oceanic sound. Harlan built a fire with dry deadfall, striking flint until a spark caught the birch bark. The flames cast dancing orange light against the rock wall of the hollow. Josie sat on her bedroll. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the lint-covered remnant of her peppermint stick, and held it out to the boy. The boy stared at it. He looked at Josie, then at Harlan, who was slicing salt pork into a cast-iron skillet. Slowly, his dirt-stained hand reached out and took the candy. He put it in his mouth, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. "What's your name?" Josie asked, tilting her head. The boy chewed the candy. He swallowed hard. Thomas. Harlan's hands stopped moving. The knife hovered over the pork. Thomas. Harlan's father's name. He had told Sarah that once, lying on a quilt by the Platte River, smelling the sweetgrass in her hair. He had said if he ever had a boy, he'd name him Thomas, after the only decent man he'd ever known. Harlan carefully set the knife down. He stared into the fire, letting the smoke sting his eyes to hide the sudden burning wetness there. "Where's your folks, Thomas?" Josie asked, lacking the tact of an adult. "Joe," Harlan warned, his voice low. "It's all right," Thomas said. His voice was raspy, unused to speaking without permission. "My pa died before I was born. Mother said he was a mountain man. Got killed by a bear, she told me." Harlan closed his eyes. The lie. The merciful, tragic lie she had invented to explain the absence of a father. She hadn't married the railroad man, or if she had, he hadn't stayed. She had kept the child. She had kept the name. "And your mother?" Harlan forced the words out of his throat. They felt like jagged glass. Thomas looked down at his oversized boots. "Cholera in St. Louis. 2 winters back. The bank took the boarding house, sent me to an orphanage. Then a man bought my papers and brought me west." The boy reached under the collar of his ruined shirt. He pulled out a piece of rawhide string hanging around his neck. Dangling from the end of it was a brass button. Harlan recognized it instantly. It was a button off a cavalry coat. His coat. He had given it to Sarah the night he left for the goldfields, telling her to hold on to it until he came back with a ring. The breath shuddered out of Harlan's lungs. The contradiction of it all threatened to crush him. He was furious at her for leaving him. He was devastated that she had died alone in a filthy city. And he was overwhelmed by the crushing weight of the boy sitting 3 feet away, wearing his father's eyes and carrying his father's button. "She said he was a good man," Thomas whispered, staring at the brass button in the firelight. "My pa. She said he was the bravest man she ever knew, but I guess he wasn't brave enough to come back for us." The words weren't meant to cut, but they sliced Harlan open from collarbone to stomach. The boy's voice held no anger, just the quiet, dull resignation of a child who had learned early that the world was a machine designed to break you. Harlan stood up. The skillet hissed on the coals. "Eat the pork when it's crispy," he muttered to Josie. He walked away from the firelight, stepping into the freezing darkness of the pines. He leaned his heavy shoulder against the rough bark of a tree, tilted his head back, and stared up at the indifferent, icy stars scattered across the black sky. He didn't weep. Men like Harlan didn't cry. The moisture that leaked from his eyes was just a biological reaction to a pain too large for his chest cavity. He pressed the heels of his rough hands into his eye sockets until he saw bursts of color. He had failed Sarah. He had let his pride and his greed keep him in the mountains while she withered in a slum. But the boy was here. Miraculously, terribly, the boy was here. Harlan took a deep, freezing breath. The pine-scented air filled his lungs, steadying the violent shaking in his hands. He couldn't fix the past. He couldn't resurrect the dead. But he could shoot straight, he knew how to build a fire in a blizzard, and he knew how to survive. He turned back toward the camp. Through the trees, he saw the firelight throwing warm, golden shadows against the rock. Josie was handing Thomas a piece of fried pork on the end of a stick. The boy took it, blowing on the hot meat, and for the first time since Harlan had seen him on that auction block, Thomas didn't look terrified. He just looked hungry. Harlan stepped back into the light. He picked up his coffee tin and poured a cup of black, bitter liquid. He walked over and sat down on a log across the fire from the boy. Thomas looked up at him, wary again. Harlan met his pale gray eyes. He didn't offer a grand speech. He didn't tell the boy the truth. Not tonight. Tonight, the truth was too heavy for a starving 9-year-old to carry. Tonight, the only thing that mattered was the food, the fire, and the mountain. "Eat up, Tom," Harlan said, his voice dropping its harsh edge, softening into something almost gentle. "We got a long climb tomorrow. Snow's coming." Thomas chewed the pork. He looked at Harlan, then at the fire. Slowly, he nodded. "Yes, sir." Harlan took a sip of his coffee. It tasted like ash and cheap grounds. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He watched the 2 children by the fire, the wind howling through the dark pines above them, and for the first time in a decade, the mountain didn't feel so empty. If this story made you feel the grit, heartache, and raw redemption of the true West. Don't let the journey end here. Hit that like button to let me know you want more grounded, deeply human stories. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a real, gritty narrative, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a tale from the frontier. Keep the campfire burning, and I'll see you on the next trail.